The first time Dasan saw her, she was standing on the other side of the San Pedro River, where the cottonwoods grew thick and green, and the land no longer belonged to his people. Her dress was the pale color of worn parchment, her hair loose and dark, whipping across her face in the wind. She was the daughter of the man who had burned Dasan's village 2 winters ago, and she was staring straight at him. The water between them was narrow, but the hate felt wide as a canyon. He gripped his bow tighter, knuckles white beneath the sunlight. He'd been sent to scout the edge of the settlers' land, not to find her, not to look into those unflinching eyes that looked nothing like her father's, but carried the same curse, the reminder of everything he'd lost. Rhea hadn't meant to cross paths with him that morning. She'd only come to gather herbs near the shallows, where her father said the land was safe. No Apache would dare come this close. But then she saw him, tall and quiet as a shadow, his braid heavy with dust and wind. He didn't speak, neither did she. The river's murmur filled the silence between them. Then he did something she didn't expect. He lowered his bow. Rhea's heart pounded, not from fear but from confusion. She wanted to believe the stories her father told, that the Apache were savages, raiders, thieves. But there was nothing wild in the way he looked at her, only anger, and something colder beneath it. "Go home," Dasan said finally, voice flat. His English was rough but sharp enough to cut through the wind. Rhea's chin lifted. "You go home," she said back. And that was when he smiled, not kindly but with disbelief. It was the first time anyone had ever spoken to him like that across enemy land. He turned and disappeared into the trees, but for the rest of the day she couldn't shake the sound of his voice, or the way the air had felt charged, like lightning that never struck. That night, Dasan returned to camp near the Red Cliffs. His brother asked what he saw beyond the river. He lied and said nothing, but in truth, he saw her, the enemy's daughter, with eyes that refused to look away. He didn't know why that unsettled him more than the thought of war. And as the night grew colder, he told himself it meant nothing. But the wind carried her name, a name he didn't yet know, through the pines like a whisper he couldn't forget. Days passed, and the river became their silent battleground. Dasan saw her again 3 mornings later, standing by the same patch of reeds. The air was cool and gray with mist, the kind that blurred the lines between earth and water. He didn't intend to stop. He had orders to scout, to watch the soldiers and settlers that were pressing deeper into Apache land. But the moment he saw her pale figure across the river, still as a spirit, his steps slowed. She was kneeling by the water, washing blood from her hands, not her own, but from the rabbit she'd just skinned. Her movements were careful, practiced, and quiet. She didn't look up until she felt him watching. When she did, her eyes sharpened. The air between them felt like a drawn bowstring. Dasan didn't raise his weapon this time. He simply watched. There was no reason to speak, no reason to cross that river. Yet something about her stillness, the calm, deliberate way she moved, unsettled him more than open hostility ever could. "You follow me now?" She called across the water. Her tone wasn't afraid. It was almost mocking. He didn't answer, and she smirked like she'd won something. "I thought warriors hunted deer," she said, "not women." Dasan's jaw tightened. "You think too loud for someone who stands on stolen ground." Rhea froze, the words stinging sharper than she expected. "This land wasn't yours to keep," she said. It was ours before your father's men came." He stepped closer to the river's edge, and for a moment, the mist parted enough for her to see the faint scar running down the left side of his neck, thin but deep, like a knife's whisper that never healed. She wanted to look away but couldn't. "My father's trying to bring peace," she said finally. Dasan laughed, a low, humorless sound that carried through the morning fog. "Peace?" he repeated. "Your kind burns our homes and then calls it peace." Rhea's throat went tight. She wanted to argue, to say something that would make her father's side seem less cruel. But she'd seen the raids too. She'd seen the fires and the blood. Her father never spoke of what he'd done in those villages, so she said nothing. Dasan noticed that silence, and it unnerved him more than her words ever did. Most people spat lies or fear, but she didn't. She just looked at him like she was trying to understand something she wasn't supposed to. He turned away first. "Stay off this river," he said. Ria's reply was quiet. "You don't command me." He paused mid-step but didn't turn back. And though he left, his pulse stayed unsteady for the rest of the day. That night, Rhea sat beside the fire in her father's camp, staring into the flames as her father's men talked of clearing the Apache from nearby land. They spoke of them like animals, savages, ghosts, raiders. Her father, gray-haired and iron-eyed, said, "We'll drive them north by next moon." She didn't speak, but her stomach twisted. She remembered the man across the river, the cold intelligence in his eyes. That wasn't a savage. That was someone who understood the cost of survival better than they ever would. And when one of her father's men asked if she was afraid of the Apache, she answered, "No," but her hand was still trembling under the table. Dasan, meanwhile, sat around a smaller fire under the cliffs. His brother Nietzsche was sharpening his knife beside him. "You've been gone too long by the river," Nietzsche said quietly. "You're watching them again." Dasan didn't deny it. "You think she'll warn them?" his brother asked. Dasan looked toward the darkness beyond the firelight. "No," he said after a moment. "She doesn't know which side she stands on." Nietzsche gave a low grunt. "Then she's dangerous," Dasan nodded. But his mind was elsewhere. On the image of her hands, washing the blood from the rabbit, her face pale in the mist, her defiance unbroken even when she was alone. He should have hated her completely. And he did, mostly. But hate had begun to take a strange shape, one he didn't recognize. 2 nights later, the soldiers came. The settlers had moved their boundary markers again, pushing closer to the Apache hunting trails. Dasan's patrol spotted them from the ridges, rifles, wagons, mules. And among them, he saw her. Rhea. She was riding behind her father's wagon, her hair tied back this time, her face hidden beneath a scarf. She looked uneasy, her gaze darting toward the trees. Dasan watched from above, silent as a ghost. When gunfire broke out, a short, sharp clash between the patrol and a few Apache scouts, chaos erupted. Dasan saw her fall from her horse when it reared, her foot catching in the stirrup. The wagon jolted forward, dragging her for a moment before her boot tore free. She hit the dirt hard. Dust and screams filled the air. Without thinking, Dasan moved. He dropped from the ridge, sprinted through the brush, and pulled her up before she could even register who had grabbed her. Her eyes widened, and for the briefest second, recognition flickered. "You," she gasped. "Stay down," he growled, dragging her behind a fallen log as bullets whistled through the air. She was trembling, trying to pull away. "Let me go. You'll die if I do." The fight lasted only minutes but felt longer. When the noise faded and the soldiers retreated, Dasan stood, his bow still drawn, scanning for movement. Rhea stayed low, chest heaving. She looked at him differently now. Not like an enemy, but like something she didn't have a word for. When he finally turned back to her, she said, almost accusingly, "Why help me?" Dasan didn't answer at first. The wind blew dust between them. "Because you're not worth dying over," he said flatly. But when he walked away, his heart betrayed the lie, pounding hard, unsteady, and unwilling to forget the way she'd looked at him in that moment. Not with hatred, not with gratitude, but something raw and wordless. That night, she dreamed of him, the smell of dust and smoke, the warmth of his hand when he pulled her out of danger, and when she woke, she hated him for it. He was her enemy, and somehow that made the memory burn even deeper. The desert was quiet after the fight, too quiet. Dasan walked until his legs burned, his hands still smelling of dust and gunpowder. The sun had set long ago, but his mind replayed that single moment again and again. The flash of fear in her eyes, the way her pulse had raced beneath his hand when he pulled her from the dirt. He hated that he remembered how warm she felt. He hated that she hadn't looked away. By the time he reached camp, the others were already there. Naiche was tending to a wounded scout, and old Tohoni sat by the fire, carving a new bow handle with a stone knife. Dasan dropped to a crouch beside them, saying nothing. "You saw them again, didn't you?" Tohoni said without looking up. His voice was old bark, rough and knowing. Dasan didn't respond. "You saved one of them," Naiche muttered. Word spreads fast. Dasan's head lifted sharply. "Who told you that?" "One of the scouts," Naiche said, meeting his gaze. "They saw you pull her down. A settler girl. She was in the way," Dasan said coldly. "I didn't do it for her," Naiche smirked. "Then why can't you stop thinking about it?" Dasan's hand twitched toward his knife, but he said nothing. He didn't have an answer. On the other side of the river, Rhea was no less haunted. Her father's camp was restless. Men shouting, cursing, arguing about ambushes and blame. Rhea sat near the fire, her shoulder bruised, her palm scraped raw from the fall. Her father, Captain Warren, stood pacing before the flames. "You should never have gone near the wagons," he snapped. "You could have been killed." "I was helping," she said quietly. "Helping? You were a distraction." He slammed his fist against a crate. "Do you have any idea what would have happened if one of them got to you?" "One of them did," Rhea said before she could stop herself. Her father froze. "What?" She hesitated. Too long. The flicker of suspicion in his eyes was enough to make her regret speaking. "One of the Apache," she said slowly. "He pulled me down before the shots reached me." "Then he left." Her father's voice hardened. "Why?" "I don't know." Captain Warren stepped closer, lowering his voice. "If you ever see him again, you tell me. Do you understand? We can use him, or make an example of him." Rhea didn't reply. Her chest tightened. When he finally turned away, she let out a slow, trembling breath. She didn't understand why she hadn't told her father everything. About the look in Dasan's eyes. The strange quiet that wasn't cruelty, but something deeper, something she couldn't explain. The next few days were dry and windless. The air carried dust that clung to everything: clothes, skin, thoughts. Dasan tried to forget her by burying himself in work. He hunted, scouted, carved new arrows, but every time he closed his eyes, he saw her. Her defiant face through the mist, her trembling voice behind the log, the way she'd looked at him after the battle ended. He told himself it was weakness, that it was nothing but a trick of guilt. But one evening, as the sun dipped low, he found himself near the river again. He didn't plan it. His feet just took him there. The air was still. The river shimmered gold beneath the fading light. And there she was, standing knee-deep in the water, her dress hiked slightly to keep dry, washing a strip of torn cloth. For a long moment, he just watched. Then her voice cut through the quiet. "You don't hide well," he stiffened. "You shouldn't be here." She looked over her shoulder, eyes narrowing. "Neither should you." He didn't move closer, but he didn't leave either. The tension between them hung heavy, like a storm that refused to break. "You saved me," she said finally, not as thanks, more like an accusation. Dasan said nothing. "Why?" she pressed. He looked at her directly then, eyes dark, jaw set. "Because you were in my way. Nothing more." She smiled bitterly. "You're a terrible liar." Dasan's breath hitched. He didn't know if it was anger or something else. "You talk too much for someone whose people have done nothing but destroy," he said. "And yours haven't?" She snapped. "You raid, you burn. We fight to survive." His voice rose, echoing across the water. "You take what's ours and call it civilization. You kill and call it law. Don't tell me who's right." Her face fell, but she didn't turn away. Instead, she stepped closer to the bank until the water lapped at her ankles. "And what are you then?" she asked softly. "A man without a home? Or one too afraid to admit he still has a heart?" Dasan's throat tightened. He didn't expect her to speak that way. Sharp, honest, unguarded. For a second, it felt like she saw right through the layers of anger and duty he wore like armor. He turned his back on her. "You don't know me." "Maybe I don't," she said. "But I don't think you know yourself either." He paused, his fists curling. "Go home, Rhea." She blinked, surprised that he knew her name. He walked off before she could ask how. That night, Dasan dreamed of fire, of the raid that took everything from him. But this time, when he ran through the smoke, it wasn't the soldiers he saw. It was her, standing in the flames, eyes reflecting every ounce of hate and grief he'd ever felt. He woke in a cold sweat, his brother still asleep beside the fire. For the first time in years, he felt uncertain. He wasn't sure if she was haunting him as a ghost from the past, or becoming something far more dangerous. A reason to question everything he'd believed. The sun had barely risen when Rhea made her choice. She wrapped a faded shawl around her shoulders, packed a small pouch of herbs and dried meat, and left before her father woke. The guards by the campfire barely noticed her slip away, just another shadow moving through dawn's fog. The air smelled of sage and dust. The river wasn't far. She told herself she wasn't going to find him. She told herself it was curiosity, unfinished words, a need for answers. But the truth burned quietly beneath her ribs. She wanted to see him again. The Apache. Dasan was scouting high along the ridge when he saw her. A single figure, cloaked and alone, moving along the river trail below. Her gait was familiar, cautious but determined. He crouched low, watching her weave through the brush. "Fool girl," he muttered under his breath. He should have turned back, should have let her learn what happened to outsiders who wandered too close. But something about her alone in that wide, cruel desert, it dug under his skin like a thorn. He followed. When she stopped by a cluster of rocks to rest, he stepped from the shadows. "You shouldn't be here," she flinched, spinning toward him, eyes wide before narrowing into defiance. "You again," he folded his arms. "If you keep walking this way, you'll cross into our hunting grounds." "I came to talk," she said. Dasan's brow furrowed. "Talk?" Rhea met his stare without flinching. "You said my people destroy. You said we take. But I've seen enough of both sides to know there's blood on everyone's hands. So maybe," he cut her off sharply. "Don't pretend you understand war." "I'm not pretending," she snapped. "I've seen your raids. I've seen your wounded too. I've helped them when no one else would." Dasan's jaw tightened. "Lies. Then why do you look like you want to believe me?" The silence that followed was thick as smoke. Her words had weight, not from arrogance, but from something rawer, truer. For the first time, he didn't see the daughter of a soldier. He saw a woman standing in front of him with a fire in her chest that refused to go out. "You should go back before someone finds you," he said. "I'm not afraid," she whispered. "That's your problem." The wind shifted then, a sudden change that made Dasan stiffen. He turned his head slightly, listening. Distant hoofbeats. He grabbed her wrist and pulled her down behind the rocks just as a group of riders appeared along the ridge. White uniforms, rifles glinting in the light. Rhea gasped softly. "My father's men, they're hunting," Dasan said, his voice low. But not for deer. They crouched in silence as the riders passed. One of them stopped near the trail, glancing toward the rocks. Dasan pressed his hand lightly over Rhea's mouth. She froze, breath catching against his palm. The moment stretched thin, every sound too loud. Her heartbeat, the scrape of metal, the soft creak of saddle leather. Finally, the riders moved on. When Dasan pulled his hand away, she didn't move. She just stared at him, the space between them suddenly too close, too warm. "You saved me again," she said quietly. He looked away. "I told you to stay out of this. I didn't ask for your help. Then stop needing it." She scowled. "You're impossible." "Good," he muttered, standing. "Now leave." But she didn't. When he started to walk away, she followed, matching his pace through the narrow canyon. "Where are you going?" "To make sure you don't die before sunset." She almost smiled. "You're not very good at pretending you don't care." Dasan's steps faltered. He didn't turn around. "You talk too much." They walked in silence until dusk. The canyon walls glowed red and gold as the sun sank low, painting the desert in firelight. Rhea's feet ached, but she kept up. Dasan finally stopped near a cave hidden behind thorny brush. He turned to her. You'll stay here until it's dark. Then you go back. Understand? She nodded, sitting down by the stone wall. Her dress was dusty, her hair tangled, but there was something unbroken in her posture. Quiet strength that drew his eyes more than he wanted. As night crept in, he started a small fire. The flames cast his face in sharp amber light, tracing the scar at his neck. Rhea broke the silence first. That scar? How did you get it? Dasan didn't answer for a long time. Then, your father's men. She swallowed hard. I didn't know. Of course not. You were protected, fed, taught to think the people you kill don't bleed like you do. Her voice softened. I didn't come here to fight. Then why come at all? Rhea looked at the flames. Because I wanted to see if what I was told about your kind was true. He gave a bitter smile. And what do you think now? I think, she said slowly, you're nothing like the monsters they say you are. For a heartbeat, the only sound was the crackle of fire. Dasan looked away, jaw tight. Go home before you start to forget which side you're on. She watched him, her eyes reflecting the firelight. Maybe I already have. He turned his head sharply, but her expression didn't change. Calm, steady, unreadable. Something heavy settled between them then. Not trust, not peace. Something more fragile. Something dangerous. The night deepened. The fire burned low, and though neither spoke again, neither of them slept. The morning came heavy with dust and silence. The storm had passed, but it had left the world washed in muted colors. Browns, grays, and the faintest glint of gold where the sun touched the rocks. Dasan woke early, restless. He sat by the edge of camp sharpening his knife, though there was nothing left to hunt and no battle to prepare for. The sound of the stone against the blade was steady, methodical, the only sound that kept him from thinking. Rhea hadn't spoken to him since the night before. She had barely looked at him either, except when she thought he wouldn't notice. Every time her eyes did find him, they softened, just a little, before she forced them away again. He didn't know what angered him more, her silence, or the memory of how she'd looked at him when he had pressed her against the rock. Dasan glanced at her now, sitting by the fire, brushing her tangled hair with a carved comb she'd found in one of the abandoned wagons. Her hands trembled slightly. She wasn't used to this life, the hunger, the wind, the way the land bit back at those who didn't belong. But she didn't complain. She never did. That almost made him respect her. Almost. She caught his stare and held it this time, her expression unreadable. Then she stood and walked toward him. You're leaving me here again? She asked, her tone even. I need to find water, he replied. The horses need it. You mean you need to get away from me, she said. He didn't respond. Rhea exhaled sharply. You act like I wanted any of this, like I asked to be dragged into your world and left to survive it. You're alive, he said flatly. That's more than what you'd be if my people had found you instead of me. Then maybe I would have been better off dead, she snapped. He froze, knife still in his hand. For a long moment, neither spoke. Then he said quietly, Don't say that. Why not? You hate me. You said it yourself. Dasan looked up, his dark eyes cold and unreadable. I don't hate you. I hate what you are. And what am I? The daughter of a man who burned my village, he said simply. That hit her like a strike. She stepped back, her throat tightening. For the first time, Dasan looked away first. He stood, slid the knife back into its sheath, and turned toward the canyon. Stay here. I'll be back before sundown. But Rhea couldn't stay still. The quiet gnawed at her. The words lingered. I don't hate you. I hate what you are. It made no sense, and yet it did. It was easier for him to hate her name than her face. She followed him. Not far. Just enough to keep him in sight. His tall frame moving between the cliffs, the glint of his knife catching sunlight. She was careful not to make a sound. But when he suddenly turned, she froze. "Why are you following me?" "I didn't trust you'd come back," she lied. Dasan's jaw tightened. "You think I'd leave you to die?" "I don't know what you'd do," she shot back. He took a step closer, then another. "You think I haven't had chances to kill you? That night by the river? When you ran from me, I could have ended it." "Then why didn't you?" she asked, voice trembling. He hesitated, just a fraction, but enough for her to see it. He didn't know why. He wanted to say it was because killing her would bring him no peace, or because she reminded him too much of the things he wanted to forget. But instead, he said nothing. When they reached the canyon floor, the light had shifted. The air shimmered with heat. They found the stream at last, thin but running, carving through the stone like a silver scar. Dasan knelt, filled the leather flask, then looked up. Rhea had taken off her boots, stepping into the cool water with a soft sigh. For a moment she looked almost free, hair unbound, dress clinging to her knees, sunlight catching her skin. He hated that he noticed. "You shouldn't be that careless," he said. "It's water, not a weapon. Out here, anything can be." She laughed, quietly, bitterly. "You see danger in everything, even me." "I've seen what happens when I don't," he replied. Their eyes met. The sound of water filled the space between them. Then, from the cliffs above, a sudden echo, a snap, a shift of rock. Dasan reacted instantly, pulling her behind him. The arrow hit the ground where she'd been standing. "Get down!" he hissed. They dove behind a fallen log. Dasan scanned the ridge, spotting movement. 2 riders, their silhouettes outlined against the sun, not his people. Rhea's breath came fast. "Who are they?" "Your father's men," he said grimly. Her face went pale. "Stay here." He reached for his bow. "Don't move, no matter what happens." Dasan, but he was already gone, melting into the rocks like a shadow. She heard the sharp whistle of his arrows, the thud of bodies hitting dirt. Then silence. When he returned, his arm was bleeding. "Are they dead?" she whispered. He nodded. "They were tracking us, probably since the river." She pressed her shawl against his arm, stopping the blood. "You're hurt." "It's nothing." "You keep saying that," she said quietly. "But it always is something." He didn't answer. He just watched her, the way her hands shook, the way her breath trembled when she leaned close. And for the first time she didn't pull away. They didn't stop moving until the sun sank behind the cliffs and the air turned cold. Rhea's feet ached, her throat burned, and the only sound was their breathing and the whisper of sand shifting under their boots. Dasan didn't look back once. He just kept walking, one hand pressed against his wound, the other steady on his bow. When they finally reached a narrow cave hidden between 2 ridges, he stopped. "We stay here tonight," he said, voice low and tight. Rhea dropped to her knees, exhausted. "They were your enemies, not mine," she muttered. "Why do they keep coming?" Dasan didn't answer at first. He crouched at the cave's entrance, scanning the distance before finally saying, "Because they think you're still theirs to take back." She looked up sharply. "I'm not theirs," he met her eyes, steady, unreadable. "You're not mine either." The words stung more than she expected. He tore a strip from his shirt and pressed it to his arm where the arrow had grazed him. Rhea frowned. "That's going to fester if you don't clean it." "It's fine." "It's not," she snapped, grabbing the flask from his belt before he could stop her. She poured water over the wound, ignoring his grunt of pain. You can glare all you want, she said, but I'm not letting you die just because you think it's easier than letting me help you. Dasan's jaw tightened. You talk too much. Maybe, she said, meeting his gaze without flinching. But I'm right. He didn't argue this time. For a while, silence filled the cave. Only the sound of the fire crackling and the wind moaning outside. Dasan sat with his back against the wall, watching the flames. Rhea sat across from him, legs pulled close, blanket wrapped tight around her shoulders. The light painted her face gold and amber, and the shadows softened the edges of her anger. Finally, she said quietly, "How many more do you think will come?" "Enough to make it difficult," he replied. "They'll keep looking until they find a body, yours or mine." Her chest tightened. "You're not making it sound very hopeful." He gave a faint smile, the first she'd ever seen from him. It was barely there, but it changed him. Hope is a soft thing, Rhea. The desert eats soft things first. "You've survived it," she said. He looked at her, really looked at her. Not without scars. She wanted to ask him about them, but something in his tone stopped her. Instead, she stared into the fire and said, "When I was a child, my father used to say the desert had eyes, that it watched everything you did. Maybe that's why it feels like it knows us." "It does," Dasan said. "It remembers every drop of blood that's fallen into it." Rhea swallowed hard. "Even mine?" He didn't answer, but she saw the flicker of something in his eyes. Guilt, maybe, or recognition. The wind howled louder outside, shaking sand loose from the rock ceiling. Dasan moved closer to the entrance to block the cold. "Sleep," he said. She hesitated. "You? I'll keep watch." "You haven't slept since the river." "I don't need it." "You're lying." His mouth twitched. "You always talk this much before you sleep?" "Only when I'm scared." He glanced over his shoulder. "Then don't be." She stared at him for a long moment, then lay down near the fire. She didn't close her eyes, though. She watched him. The way his profile looked against the glow, sharp and quiet. The scar across his jaw catching the light. He was the most dangerous man she had ever met, but for the first time, she didn't feel like he would hurt her. At some point, she must have dozed off. When she woke, it was deep night. The fire had burned low, and Dasan was gone. Panic seized her chest. She sat up fast, scanning the cave, then saw him outside, standing on a ridge under the moonlight. He wasn't alone. Another figure stood across from him. One of his own people. Cloaked in furs, their conversation hushed but intense. Rhea crept closer, careful not to make a sound. "I said no." Dasan's voice was sharp but quiet. "She is the daughter of the man who slaughtered our kin." The other said, "If the council learns you're hiding her, they won't. You can't keep her, Dasan. You know what she represents." He was silent for a moment. Then, "I know exactly what she represents. That's why I won't hand her over." Rhea's pulse quickened. The other man stared at him for a long while, then said, "You'll die for her." Dasan didn't flinch. "If that's the cost, so be it." The man shook his head and disappeared into the night. Rhea stayed frozen behind the rocks, heart pounding. He had lied to his own people, for her. When he finally turned back toward the cave, she was already pretending to sleep. Dasan stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching her, the faintest trace of something soft crossing his face before he turned away. Outside, the moonlight stretched across the sand, pale and cold, and the desert, just like he'd said, remembered everything. Dawn crawled slowly over the canyon, painting the rocks in pale fire. The air was cold enough that Rhea's breath came out in thin white clouds. She stirred awake to find Dasan gone again. But this time, he hadn't gone far. He was by the stream, washing the blood from his arm. Rhea wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders and walked to him. "You should have woken me," she said softly. "I didn't want to." "Why not?" "You looked peaceful," he said, still focused on the water. "You don't look like that often." She didn't know what to say to that. For a long time, they just listened to the stream, The quiet between them wasn't sharp like before. It had softened into something that felt almost fragile. Finally, Rhea said, "I heard you last night." Dasan froze. "You talked to one of your own," she continued. "He told you to give me up." His jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have been listening. You were going to die because of me." He turned then, eyes hard. "Because of you?" "Yes," she snapped. "You could have walked away, Dasan. You could have told them where I was. You could have let them take me and none of this would have mattered." His voice rose rough and raw. "You think that's what I wanted? To let them tear you apart because of what your father did?" She stared at him, heart pounding. "Why didn't you then? Why do you care what happens to me?" He stepped closer, slow, deliberate, until the air between them was tight with something neither of them wanted to name. "I don't," he said, but his voice betrayed him. "Yes, you do. Stop. You could have killed me 100 times, but you didn't. You hate what I am, remember? The daughter of the man who burned your home. But I'm not him, Dasan. I'm not anyone's weapon anymore." His hands clenched at his sides. "You don't understand." "Then make me." He looked at her then, really looked, and something inside him gave way. His voice dropped low. "Because when I look at you, I see everything I swore I'd never feel again. And it terrifies me." Rhea's breath caught. For a long moment, they stood there, the sound of water and wind, wrapping around them like the earth itself had gone quiet to listen. "Then stop running. From it," she whispered. Dasan's hand lifted before he even realized it, fingers brushing against her cheek. Light and uncertain. She didn't pull away. He leaned in, forehead resting against hers. "You shouldn't want this," he said. "But I do," she breathed, and when he kissed her, it wasn't soft. It was everything they had been holding back. The fury, the grief, the ache of two lives built on opposite sides of war. For the first time, the world stopped fighting them. They broke apart only when the wind shifted, carrying the faint echo of distant hooves. Dasan's eyes snapped open. "They found us," Rhea grabbed his arm. "Then we run." They took off through the canyon, the pounding of horses closing in behind them. Dasan guided her down narrow paths, across jagged rocks, through clouds of dust that burned their throats. Arrows whistled past. One struck the ground inches from Rhea's foot. He pushed her ahead, shouting, "Keep going!" They reached the end of the canyon, a cliff overlooking the valley below. No time to turn back. Rhea stared over the edge, heart hammering. "We'll die if we jump." Dasan glanced back, riders closing fast. "Maybe, but if we stay, we will for sure." He took her hand. "Trust me." She hesitated for only a heartbeat, then nodded. They jumped. The world spun, air, sand, and light. They hit the slope below hard, tumbling through brush until they came to rest beside the riverbank. The water roared beside them. Dasan coughed, grabbed her hand again. "Come on." They stumbled into the trees, hiding in the thicket. The riders passed above them, shouts fading into the distance. When silence returned, Rhea let out a shaky laugh that sounded half like a sob. "You're insane," Dasan smirked weakly. "You jumped." "I trusted you." He looked at her then, and this time his smile reached his eyes. "That might be the most dangerous thing you've ever done." The river carried them farther than they realized. By the time the sun climbed high, their clothes clung to their skin, and their bodies ached from the fall. The current slowed near a cluster of tall cottonwoods, their roots twisting through the mud like old hands. Rhea stumbled out first, water streaming down her dress, breath shaking. "I can't believe we're alive," she said. Dasan followed, dragging himself onto the bank. His lip was split, a fresh cut bleeding above his brow, but he was smiling. Just a little. "You doubted me." "I still do," she said, though her voice was gentler than her words. He glanced toward the horizon. The canyon walls were far behind them now, but faint smoke rose in the distance. "They'll track us. We can't stay long. Then where?" Dasan scanned the land around them, the vast desert giving way to low hills covered in sage and scrub. "There's an old settlement north of here," he said. "Hidden, abandoned long ago. We'll rest there before deciding." They walked until evening, following the river upstream. The air smelled of wet earth and juniper, the kind of scent that carried memories. Every step was quiet, not the uneasy silence of strangers, but the heavy stillness of two people who'd already said everything that mattered. When they reached the settlement, Rhea almost didn't recognize it. The place was swallowed by vines, roofs caved in, doorways eaten by dust. But it was shelter, and that was enough. Inside one of the old huts, the wood still held together. Dasan checked the corners, always cautious, then motioned for her to sit. "Stay here," he said. "I'll gather wood," Rhea nodded. When he was gone, she looked around. Broken pottery, a rusted knife, a small woven basket half buried in dirt. Someone had lived here once, maybe loved here too. When Dasan returned, his arms full of firewood, she met him with a quiet smile. "You always look like you carry the whole desert on your shoulders." He set the wood down. "Someone has to," she laughed softly. "You could let someone else help sometimes." Dasan looked at her, long, thoughtful. "That would mean trusting them. And you don't?" He hesitated. "I didn't. Not until you." The air between them shifted again. That slow, unspoken gravity pulling them closer. He lit the fire, and for a while they just watched the flames. Outside, the wind whispered through the ruins. The heat washed over them, soft and golden. Rhea leaned forward. "You said you used to have scars from surviving the desert." He looked down at his hands. "Everyone who lives long enough does. I want to know about them." Dasan sighed. "One from a raid when I was 15. One from a hunt gone wrong. One from my own brother when we fought over who'd stay and who'd leave." "Did he stay?" "No, he died for it." Rhea reached out before she could stop herself, her fingers brushing the edge of his wrist. "You've lost too much." He met her eyes. "So have you." Something broke open in her chest. "All my life I was told who to hate, who to obey, who to become. And now I don't know who I am without it." Dasan leaned closer, voice low. "You're the woman who walked through the desert and didn't look away." Her eyes filled, though she didn't know why. "Why do you always know what to say?" "I don't," he murmured. "I just know what it feels like to be lost." They didn't kiss this time. They didn't need to. The way his hand covered hers, the way she leaned against him was enough. That night, the wind carried whispers, hoofbeats in the distance, faint but growing. Dasan's eyes snapped open. He grabbed his bow, motioned for silence. Rhea stiffened beside him. Through the broken window, shadows moved, torches flickering between trees. "They found us," she whispered. He nodded. "We'll go out the back. Stay close." But as they slipped into the darkness, a voice rang out, one she recognized instantly. "Rhea!" She froze. Her father. He stepped into the clearing, flanked by armed men, face hard and eyes furious. "I warned you what would happen if you ran with him." Dasan raised his bow, but Rhea grabbed his arm. "Please," she whispered. "Don't," her father sneered. "You think he cares for you? You're a pawn, girl. He'll throw you away when you've served his purpose." Dasan's voice was quiet but sharp. "She's no one's pawn." "You killed my men," her father said. "You stole my daughter. You think I'll let that go?" "She's not yours to own," Dasan said. Her father raised his pistol. Rhea stepped in front of Dasan before the shot rang out. The bullet missed her, but struck the tree beside them. Splinters flew. Dasan fired back, not to kill but to drive them off. The men scattered under the chaos. Her father fell, his arm grazed. When the smoke cleared, Dasan grabbed her hand. "We have to go." They ran until the voices vanished behind them, the world narrowing to the sound of their feet and their breath. When they finally stopped, Rhea was shaking. From fear, from adrenaline, from everything that had built up between them. She turned to him, voice trembling. "You could have killed him." He looked at her, the firelight from the burning torches still flickering in his eyes. "If I had, I'd have lost you forever." Her breath hitched. "You already have me." He froze, then stepped forward and pulled her into him. She clung to him, hands gripping his back, heartbeat pounding against his. "I don't want to run anymore," she whispered. "Not from you. Not from this. Dawson rested his forehead against hers. Then we stay, somewhere they can't find us. Days passed. They found a place deep in the valley. A hidden glade where the river split into quiet pools and the mountains sheltered them from the wind. They built a small fire each night, gathered roots and berries, hunted when they could. The land, wild and untouched, became theirs. Sometimes, when the sun set, Rhea would sit beside him and trace the scars on his hands. "You think the world will ever forgive us?" she asked one evening. Dawson looked out toward the horizon. "The world doesn't forgive. It forgets," she smiled faintly. "Then let it forget us." He turned to her, eyes soft. "It already has." And when he kissed her again, slow this time, sure, it didn't feel like rebellion or defiance anymore. It felt like home.